Welcome back. I hope that you're now on the way to reading Ovid's Metamorphoses. In the previous video, we finally did introduce Ovid, even though we had already previously read his work, The Heroides, before the midterm exam. And now we're going to return to our Roman history series that we broke off with the end of the Roman Republic prior to the midterm. So by the time you come into Ovid's Metamorphoses, we're now talking about an author who grew up only as a boy, seeing the Republic falling apart. This is in contrast to Virgil, who was already grown up when his father's estate was seized, and then he, subsequent to that, saw the Roman Republic fall apart. So here we have Ovid, who writes quite a few works that are culturally rather tricky in regard to Roman culture. And as we talked about in the Ovid video, it's possible that one or more of those videos could potentially have gotten him exiled. Now, to understand the history of what lies in back of Ovid's works, we have to talk about the empire as it grew out of the Roman Republic as it fell apart. So, at the end of the previous video about Roman history, we concluded with the Battle of Actium, which occurred in 31 BC, and we now come into the empire itself with Emperor Augustus. Now you notice that this starts in 27 BC, so we have a 4-year gap in between that we have to bridge to understand how we go from Republic that's fallen apart to empire that takes the city of Rome and the world around it into a whole new dimension. So, first of all, let's remember that Augustus was the previous Octavian. Now, Octavian, as we mentioned in the previous historical video, was the survivor from the second triumvirate among Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus. And when Octavian defeated Antony at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, essentially he became sole ruler of Rome. And so effectively, the second triumvirate really got converted into a one-man rule that the Senate now had essentially allowed for the possibility of Octavian to take on one man. And of course, as you may remember when we talked about the second triumvirate, Octavian had this status. Even though it's here, I'm writing it here again because you need to remember that Imperium Maius, in addition to referring to Augustus as emperor, also refers to Octavian prior to his becoming emperor already under the second triumvirate. So this term is vital. Whether you see it here or here, you need to pay close attention to it. All right, so when Octavian became sole ruler of Rome effectively, he was in fact out in the provinces. Now, he had responded back in 44 BC to the assassination of his adopted father, Julius Caesar, by returning from the provinces to Rome and bringing together his soldiers that were loyal to him. Octavian grew up under Caesar's close watch and developed a lot of friendships with many of the soldiers he served with. So once it was his turn to be in control, he had already garnered a lot of loyalty from all those soldiers. So when he needed to call upon them to support him after Caesar's death, they were there available for him. And that was going to end up making a difference as militarily he advanced in the following decade to finally emerge as sole ruler. So Octavian spent a few years going around the provinces and tidying things up essentially in order to support the new empire. In fact, however, he was attempting to make it appear that the empire itself was really just a continuation of the Republic, but in a somewhat modified form. And I'm now going to erase this. And I'm going to put up the term that was technically ascribed to the emperor, which was princeps. Now, this is in distinction to the proper word for emperor, which is imperator. Now, imperator essentially is a commander, somebody with imperium. That could include a general, but also was a reference to the emperor himself. But princeps is a looser term that refers to the first citizen. It's actually primus and then civis that gives us princeps, the first citizen among all the citizens of Rome. Now, this particular person would essentially represent the interests of the citizenship body in the now Roman Empire, and would pass legislation which then formally is supposed to be ratified by the Senate. Augustus went to considerable trouble to ensure that his relationship with the Senate, at least cordially, involved the two of them working together, at least on the surface, to pass whatever legislation was needed. In reality, of course, the emperor took the increasing role of passing the legislation himself, and it did not take too long after Augustus's principate before eventually the emperor was simply making all the decisions, and the Senate, while in a position to object, really could do nothing more than just rubber stamp their approval on anything the emperor did. And if they really wanted to object and get the emperor out of there, they would have to resort to the infamous Praetorian Guard to stage an assassination. Or there might be other ways to advise the emperor that he needed to change his mind, maybe. But the emperor eventually ended up becoming the sole decision maker in the Roman Empire. So, Imperium Maius, that is the term we just mentioned, was granted to the three triumvirs, now takes on a new dimension. Remember I mentioned that Octavian was out in the provinces in both occasions before returning to Italy. You may remember, and may have actually perhaps wondered, that that is a problem, because Octavian is the possessor of Imperium, but recall that the Imperium that one has in the provinces cannot be brought back into Rome, or vice versa. So there is one additional aspect to Imperium Maius that Octavian makes certain to maintain once he is emperor, and that is Imperium Maius, in addition to being superior to the power of all the other magistrates, such as the consuls, also is excused from the restriction about Imperium being forced to be only in the province of Italy or only in the provinces outside Italy. In other words, now Octavian, eventually Augustus, was able to travel wherever he pleased and keep his Imperium with him, and therefore maintain that authority, and he would not have to keep putting it down, picking it back up every single time he wanted to traverse the Italian border. And so Imperium Maius, therefore, specifically transfers Imperium really away from consuls as the high magistrates at Rome to now this princeps, who now is basically in charge of the entire region of the Roman Empire solely, and has the power to go around and administer any part of the empire any way he wants to. And of course, also importantly, the emperor is still in fact the general, and therefore is likely to go out on campaign should there be any need to deal with any security issues or any military matters, as is especially notable with the later emperor Marcus Aurelius. So that is how Augustus saw to it eventually that he was in fact vested with full power over Rome, and to his credit, he did administer his power relatively wisely in the repairing of the city of Rome and the provinces, in order to bring considerable solidarity among the provinces together to support Rome and accept the city of Rome as in charge of the entire dominion. Okay, so after his return home, he was awarded a full triumph by the city of Rome, and then in 27 BC, he received a very important position. Now, it's interesting to note this particular title I'm about to write up. First of all, princeps, you notice, we mentioned before, is first citizen. But of course, if you notice the first 6 letters, P-R-I-N-C-E, that gives us the word prince in English. So a princeps almost has the sense of regality, but it's important to remember that the Romans would never have tolerated a king in their midst after their rather unhappy experience with the 7 kings of Rome. Now, however, here is the term that the Senate gives to Augustus. Pater Patriae, which means literally the father of his countryland, and in this context has the sense of savior, the savior of the countryland. Pater, however, you may remember, is also the specific term for a senator. So essentially, Augustus is receiving here a senatorial honorarium for having saved the Roman Empire. Remember that Octavian was actually technically dictator once again under the remnants of Republican rule because the Senate had passed the SCU so that he could pursue Mark Antony. So now, because he did it, the position he receives, it finally does confer that full authority on him, is Pater Patriae, and with that, with the title Augustus, which was also given to him in 27 BC, which means revered, Augustus is in charge of the state in all of its administrative and military matters. Also, Augustus conveys the sense of religious matters as well, because the word in Latin means holy, or august, like in English, revered. Augustus, in fact, saw to it in time that he was awarded the position of Pontifex Maximus, which was the highest priest position established according to tradition by the second king of Rome, Numa Pompilius, who established all of the religious positions in Rome. This was a highly prestigious and vied after position, and Augustus was very pleased to receive this. And so, in effect, the combination of emperor and pope, because pontifex is our word pontiff today, it's almost like the highest religious position, so that's like the pope today. That combination meant that effectively state and religion were merged into the one particular figure, and so all of the worships of the various gods, the deities, the Roman state religion, so to speak, all of that now effectively is brought into the power and authority of a single person. So, what did Augustus do once he had all of this power? In fact, quite a bit. In the city of Rome itself, he did quite a bit to rebuild the city after its decaying and ruined status under the late Republic. Famously, he said in his work called Res Gestae, which is the word in Latin for an accomplishment, that he found the city made out of brick and turned it around into a city made out of marble. And so that way Augustus was able to not only repair the city, but also beautify it considerably and greatly improve its position in the Roman state, but also its appearance as well. So Augustus physically repaired the city, physically beautified it again, and also established new means of watching over important city hazards, such as fire and security. So there was now the first ever fire brigade or fire department in history, and also there were security watches that divided up the day into quarters, and so these were the 4 vigiliae, which were again the watches for security. There was also a police force that could also be brought in to bear for the sake of taking somebody into custody. So Augustus did quite a bit to improve the city of Rome itself, and Augustus is to be credited with setting up the system of provincial autonomy, to the extent that as long as the provinces did give proper homage to the central city of Rome, they would be allowed to continue to carry on with their own individual culture as they saw it. However, they would have to permit Roman legions, Roman camps, and security posts to be planted in the province as needed in order to oversee the province as needed. And that could lead to some somewhat tricky interactions between Romans and local citizens. So sometimes that was a problematic arrangement. But for the most part, most of the citizens and provinces, despite their complaints about the feeling of being subordinate to this higher power, went along with it reasonably well. And the relationship between Rome and most of the provinces was at least cordial, and in some cases, in fact, quite favorable. The greatest misfortune that befell a province in 70 AD was Judea, because of the conflicts between the Jewish religion and the Roman state religion, especially when one of the governors of the province named Herod rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem, but then imposed an eagle above the door to the temple, and thereby inflamed feelings from the Jews, because Jews were not allowed by their Ten Commandments to worship any god aside from their own particular god, and the presence of the eagle above the door was a symbol of Jupiter, and therefore violated that commandment. So Judea, unfortunately, eventually was not successful at assimilating itself into the Roman Empire, and eventually came to grief in AD 70 under Emperor Vespasian and his son Titus. But aside from that, for the most part, the provinces did quite well. There were military problems on and off in some of the provinces, especially in the eastern Black Sea province of Bithynia. And the northern border was always a potential trouble spot all along. And as it expanded, the ability of the Romans to keep security up there, military watchfulness all along to ensure there would not be invasions, that became strained eventually. And again, with the later Emperor Marcus Aurelius, after a period of neglect from previous emperors, ended up having to spend quite a bit of his time along that northern border trying to put out military brush fires, as it were. He was in fact successful, but it was a long and exhausting process to resecure that northern border. Okay, so that was most of what Augustus was able to accomplish on a very, very basic level. Now, Augustus also did quite a bit to start passing a lot of new laws and reorganizing the Senate. For instance, he took a lot of the senators who had been appointed under rather shady circumstances in the late Republic out of the Senate, and so therefore reduced the number of senators quite a bit and essentially cleaned it up. And he passed many laws to now establish the new chains of command and other important areas of legislation that would be needed for the new empire. One thing Augustus did try that was not as successful as other things was morality legislation, and especially adultery. He inflicted very severe punishments that could range up to exile for anybody caught in adultery. And this is going to segue into the problem of successorship. One of the victims of this law was Augustus's own daughter, Julia. The problem with Augustus, and there's going to be a later video that's going to show the full family tree of the Julio-Claudian line. It's quite complicated. The problem that Augustus ran into was that he had no natural son. He did have 2 marriages. He had his first marriage, in which he had his daughter Julia, and then he had a second marriage, Livia, who already had a son, Tiberius, from her own previous marriage. And in fact, that line is the Claudian line. So Julio refers to the line from Julius Caesar, and the Claudian part refers to Livia's family, which was the Claudian line. So that's why it's referred to as the Julio-Claudian line. These first 5 emperors, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, are all from this particular line. So Augustus tried several times to get somebody in his own Julian line to become the next emperor, since he had no son of his own. His first pick was his nephew Marcellus. He was the son of his sister Octavia, and unfortunately Marcellus died quite young. Julia herself did have actually 3, but 2 twin sons and then another son. The 2 twin sons were Gaius and Lucius, and then she also had a third son, Posthumus. All of them ended up being mysteriously bumped off in different ways. Things happened to them, and eventually all were eliminated. One of Julia's husbands, was the General Agrippa, Marcus Agrippa, who was a very close friend of Augustus. And there was some hope of either Agrippa himself or some of his line possibly becoming the emperor. But Agrippa himself died of an illness in 12 BC. and eventually, systematically, all of his children who might have possibly become emperor all died rather mysteriously at relatively young ages. So eventually, and of course Julia herself got into a lot of adulterous relationships, and that finally got her dispossessed as well, and the two sons who might have had a chance also lost their lives as well. So with all of that happening, it came down to Tiberius, Livia's son, because Tiberius did also have a brother Drusus, who was the father of the later Emperor Claudius. But Drusus was very Republican based in his thinking. He served up in Germany and eventually died of a wound up there. So that, again, left only Tiberius. So finally, Augustus, rather reluctantly, he didn't especially care for Tiberius, did adopt Tiberius as his son and made him his heir. Now, there's a lot of questions, if you possibly have either seen or read I Claudius, about Augustus's wife Livia as to whether she may have had a hand in eliminating possible contenders for the principate of her son Tiberius. That's based on the biography of Suetonius in his massive biographical work called The 12 Caesars. Whether, in fact, Livia did carry out these murders is very hard to say, but there is a possibility that Augustus's wife Livia had a hand again in ensuring Tiberius' eventual accession to the principate after Augustus himself. Augustus himself finally passed away in AD 14, and his son Tiberius thereafter took control. So our next video will continue along the Julio-Claudian line, and we will take a look at the two emperors, Tiberius and Caligula. It was fun. We'll see you next video.